So hello, everyone. We are delighted to be hosting this as an exchange wealth of Interact event as part of the online conference series, It Take a Village Global Perspective about Care Experienced Parents. This is our first event, and we are very happy that you are here with us today. You can see the other events on our webpage, and I'll put the link in the chat box soon. I'll present our speakers very shortly. Svetlana Shpiegel is Associate Professor at the Department of Social Work and Child Advocacy in Montclair State University, New Jersey. Her research focuses primarily on the functioning of adolescents and young adults transitioning out of foster care, including those who are pregnant and parenting. Dr. Shpiegel sits on the board of the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect and has a particular interest in the use of large administrative datasets to inform child welfare policy and practice. Elizabeth Aparicio is an assistant professor in the Behavioral and Community Health Department in the University of Maryland School of Public Health. She directs the Community Thrives Lab, a research group that conducts community-engaged transformative health research at the intersection of family violence, early childhood, and adolescent sexual health intervention. She's also the deputy director for clinical training and intervention for the University of Maryland Prevention Research Center. Dr. Aparicio is a licensed clinical social worker who worked for 10 years in direct practice with expected and parenting foster youth prior to entering her academic position, where she is honored to uplift their experiences through research. The presentation of Dr. Aparicio and Dr. Shpiegel is about exploring the state of early parenthood among youth in and aging out of foster care. You can write your question and comment in the chat box, and we will refer to them at the end. We also have a Padlet, which allows you to comment and ask questions on this and other presentation after the event, and I will share the link also in the chat box. So you can start, please.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Data. Let me just make sure. Okay, there we go. I just want to mention our third co-presenter who is not here today. Her name is Amy Dworsky. She's a senior research fellow at the Chapin Hall, the University of Chicago, and she focuses her research on youth who transition out of foster care, those who are pregnant and parenting, and also this intersection between homelessness and child welfare system involvement. So she couldn't be here today, but she's also an integral part of this presentation. I just wanted to acknowledge her. So welcome, everybody. We're really hoping to have a productive discussion. The presentation is going to focus on the United States, but I think it has implications elsewhere as well. So it's nice to see that we have such variety in terms of folks who are attending. All right. So just in terms of the outline of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about early childbirth in the United States and trends over time in the general population, just to give you some context about what's been going on in this respect here in the US. And then we'll transition to talk about early childbirth and fatherhood among youth with foster care backgrounds. So we're going to talk both about youth who are in care currently, older adolescents primarily, and those who are in the process of aging out of care, of recently aged out. The time span that we'll cover is usually between ages of 16, 17 to about 21 to 23. So that's kind of the span. We're going to talk about rates of birth and fatherhood among youth in care, and then some trends over time, risk and protective factors, and then we'll transition to talking about outcomes in early adulthood, and then services and supports for young parents and evidence for effectiveness for these services. And we'll finish with some summary recommendations for research, but also for practice and policy. So in terms of, I'm not sure why this gets stuck, I apologize. So in terms of just some trends about adolescent childbirth in the United States, US has one of the highest rates of adolescent birth in the developed world, right? So it's been traditionally very high, but it has been declining in the past 20 years or so. So you could see here from the numbers that between 1991 and 2021, the rates of adolescent birth declined about 80%, which is a really big, significant decline. And the declines happened in all racial ethnic groups and in all US areas, even though right now the rates are still somewhat higher for non-white youth and also for youth who live in southern US states. So there's some geographic variability, still some variability by race ethnicity. Nevertheless, there has been a significant decline over the past few decades, and that decline is continuing. In terms of reasons for declines, there have really been two reasons that were identified in research. One of the reasons is adolescents just having less sex. They're delaying the onset of sexual intercourse. So that is affecting pregnancy and parenthood, obviously. And then the other reason is better access to contraception and access to better contraception. So those two combined result in in significant declines in early birth. Now, I want to put it out there, and this is going to be a theme throughout the presentation. We know much less about both rates and trends of adolescent fatherhood in the general population, also for youth in care. But even in the general population, whereas we collect information about birth rates pretty systematically, we don't necessarily collect information about fatherhood in that systematic manner, okay? So just putting that out there for context for us. So in recent years, there's been more attention given to early parenthood for youth in care. Those of you who are maybe not familiar with the US statistics, about 20,000 youth age out of foster care in the US every year. It's been a little bit lower in the past couple of years. I think most recently about 17,000, but on average, it's been about 20,000 for the last couple of years. And the age where youth exit foster care in the US is between 18 and 21. Most states now allow youth to stay in care until age 21. Some still do not, but that's the minority. And obviously, youth could voluntarily exit care at age 18, even if their state allows them to remain in care until age 21. And what we found in general, in terms of rates of early parenthood, is that it's higher relative to the general population peers, right? So the rates among youth who've been in care and are aging out of care are about 2 to 3 times higher. And that is true especially for females, but it's primarily because we have more information about females, right? So the rates are higher among males as well. We just have less research on males, so we know a little bit less about them. Now, there have been declines in teen birth rates for youth in care as well. So they sort of parallel the general population declines. However, the rates among youth in care have been much slower, right? So the decline has happened, but at a slower rate than for youth in the general population. And in terms of some specific rates, so we've brought to you some statistics from several large studies that have been done in the United States. Those of you who are familiar with the US context and are kind of in this research area, you are likely familiar with the Midwest study and with the CalYouth study. Those are two large studies looking at young people who are aging out of care. And if you look at the rates here, this is for females, right? So the Midwest study was done in the early 2000s, and then the CalYouth study was done in mid 2010s, right? So it began in 2013 and it is still ongoing now. So you could sort of see the differences in times there. And in the Midwest study, about 20% of girls who participated were mothers by age 17. Those rates increased to 32% by age 19, and then 56% at age 21. The CalYouth study, which again is about a decade later, about 10% for moms at age 17, 27% at age 19 and 40% at age 21. So you can see the declines. You can't necessarily compare the two studies. They're different geography, and in the United States, that matters a lot. But nevertheless, it gives us a little bit of information about kind of the declines that have happened over the past couple of years. And then we have the National Youth in Transition Database, which is a federally mandated data collection system about all youth who were in care at age 17 in the US. So all states are required to submit information about these young people, and they're followed at ages 17, 19, and 21. So this is a national database, but obviously the rates of submission differ by state, how response rates differ by state, so there is quite a bit of variability. Nevertheless, by now we have 3 cohorts of NITED. The first one started in 2011, the second in 2014, the third in 2017, and the rates have been 44% in the 2011 cohort, 38% were mothers by age 21 in the 2014 cohort, and 36% in the 2017 cohort. So again, you could see a little bit of the decline, but certainly not as steep as you have seen in the general population. And then in terms of dads, in the Midwest study, about 7% were dads at age 17, 14 at age 19, and 30% at age 21. And then in the Cal Youth study, it was 3%, 10%, and 20%, right? So again, the rates certainly seem to be lower for the Cal Youth study, which was about a decade later, but hard to compare because of geographic variation and other factors. In terms of NITED, the rates in the 2011 NITED cohort were 19%. So 19% of those who participated in all 3 waves of NITED were dads by age 21. And then in the 2014 cohort, it was 17%, and the 2017 cohort, it was about 16%. So again, a little bit of a decline, not particularly steep here. The other thing I wanted to mention, and after that, I'm going to stop to see if there might be any questions. As I've said before, the rates of early parenthood in the general population and also among youth in care are higher for Black youth, Hispanic youth, and also other youth who are not white. There are a couple of reasons for that. It's not one thing. One of the issues that have an impact here are differential access to healthcare and some disparities in that regard. So that might be one of the factors, access to contraception. There could be other cultural factors. For example, attitudes towards teen parenthood could be different by different racial and ethnic groups. And some other factors as well, including pre-existing socioeconomic disparities. Also, but the rates, again, in general, are higher for youth who are not white here in the US. And then the other thing I just want to mention briefly is that repeat parenthood is really, really common in this population. So in the NITED data, about 35%, between 35 and 65% of youth who gave birth or fathered a child by age 17 had an additional birth or fatherhood by age 21. So depending on the cohort, some rates are really, really high, could be as high as 80% for some, and as low as 35 or so. So it's really common, and a lot of the repeat births happen during this period of transition to adulthood. So between ages 19 and 21, that's when the rates really explode, right? So those youth who have been parents before, that's when they are more likely to have an additional child based on some of the data that we have. And the issue of the rates of repeat parenthood are higher for females as compared to males, even though repeat parenthood also happens among males in care. I want to stop for just a second to see if there are any questions in the chat. So Sally asked, do you have data on rates of child protective services involvement for these parents? So this is a really good question. In fact, Amy Dvorsky, who is not here today, has done some research in this area, and the rates are higher than for young people who are not involved with foster care, right? So the children of youth who have been in care are more likely to be involved with the child welfare system than the children of those who haven't been in care. I have to look at the specific rates. Dvorsky 2015 is where you would want to look for specific rates. I believe it was almost a third had at least a report for those young people. Liz, I don't know if you remember the specific statistics there.
Yeah, so it depends on the study, but it's ranges from anywhere from twice as likely to have child welfare involvement in the next generation to 5 times as likely to have a report of child abuse and neglect, which may be substantiated or not. But there's a definitely higher rates among youth who've been in foster care or youth who've been child welfare involved compared to other even adolescent parents with similar risk factors.
Yeah, so this is definitely an issue. We would, at the end, we would love to hear how this plays out in other countries potentially. But this is definitely an issue in the United States. Any other questions before we continue that I could take? Okay, so our next topic is risk factors. So a lot of the studies that looked at this particular population focused on the rates of early parenthood, which we just talked about, and also on which factors increase or decrease the likelihood of early parenthood. So in terms of risk factors, there is some variability in the studies, so we try to summarize as much as we can, and we decided to break down the risk factors to individual risks and then risks that are related to foster care experiences. So in terms of, and this, by the way, most of the studies, as I've said before, are about moms, but we also brought some studies here about that. So I will point out some specific gender effects when I can, but I also acknowledge that for a lot of that, we just don't know. So in terms of individual risks, we do know from the studies that have been conducted that engagement in risky behaviors increases the likelihood of early childbirth, right? So studies have pointed out factors such as running away from a placement, experiencing homelessness, using substances, and involvement with the criminal justice system, which, by the way, involvement with the criminal justice system was more prominent for males than it is for females as a risk factor, but present for both, according to some studies. And then disconnection from school, especially, and work, which was present for both males and females, according to the studies that we've looked at. The reasons for why these risks increase early births, there could be a variety of different things. For example, for risky behaviors, this could be kind of a proxy for a larger engagement in risk, right? So youth who are more prone to risk-taking behaviors may also be more likely to have unprotected sex. And obviously, unprotected sex can result in early births, right? So this is one explanation. And then there's some studies that talk about the connection with school and work and essentially say that, you know, when a young person when the path for self-realization through the traditional career advancement and school advancement feels blocked, right? Young people, and especially young moms, which is most of the research talked about them, they look for other paths to self-realize, and motherhood could be one of them, right? So they essentially sometimes tell themselves, well, I don't know if I could get this fantastic job that I want to get and have a great career. I don't know if I could go to school and further my education because of all the barriers and the disparities that I've experienced. So I'm going to become a mom, right? So that could be the connection between this school enrollment and employment and early births. And then there are also some risks related to youth's foster care experiences that were highlighted in prior research. One of those, and the most consistent ones, are placement in congregate care and placement instability. So youth who have been placed in group homes and institutions, and those young people who've experienced many placements over time are more likely to be giving birth early or fathering a child early. So the reason for that could be, we'll talk about kind of motivations for birth in a little bit later, but according to some studies, especially qualitative research that has looked at this, young people who haven't had stable relationships are looking for that in establishing their own family, right? So they're looking to establish the family that they never had, the relational permanency, unconditional love, and they might be motivated to have children and establish that family connection this way. So this is one hypothesis as to why these might be related, but you also could think about supervision issues, right? So lack of adult supervision, lack of sort of role models for adult role models and adult mentors who could help youth navigate things like contraception, help them sort of really fully realize the effects of early parenthood and how that might impact other domains. So that could also play a role. And then some studies also found that youth who've been reunified with their biological families and youth who were placed with kin, right, with relatives, have actually higher rates of childbirth than some of those who were placed in non-relative foster homes or were adopted. But not all studies show that. So there's some of that. It's not quite as consistent as the other two that I've mentioned. And one of the explanations that have been brought up in that regard is potentially youth who are reunified with their parents, who might also be teen parents, right, or reunified with their relatives, who might also experience early childbirth, right? So it might be considered normative in those families, and that could contribute to early birth among the youth as well. And also supervision issues and access to healthcare could also play a role here as well, because we know that many times the biological families of youth who have been in care, at least here in the United States, experience some of the socioeconomic challenges that the birth parents of these youth experience as well. Again, a caveat is most studies that we just summarize, most of them focus on females. So we really do need more on dads. There's just been a scoping review on fathers that came out. Our colleague Justin Hardy, who I think is here, I think I saw Justin somewhere here, has done, and his colleague Kristen Itier as well. So take a look at that. This is probably the most we know about dads, which is unfortunately not very much. All right. Any questions up till now? Anything you want to ask about these specific topics?
Well, we're getting some questions and just want to highlight some of the structural issues that are experienced by youth in care. So we talk a lot about individual factors, but then there's all of those structural issues with access to accurate health information, sexual health information and education, and then also access to services. So we touched a little bit on that, but just being able to access a healthcare provider, to be able to get birth control and have a discussion about timing of when to begin or expand your family, that's extremely limited for youth in care. And part of that is like just somebody taking them to appointments, opinions of people that they may be placed with regard to those services, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of structural issues that are present in addition to the individual factors. Absolutely.
And we'll also touch a little bit later on some of the geographic trends. And again, some of you have probably heard about overturning Roe versus Wade, which is the constitutional right to abortion here in the United States. So that has also been an issue, and it has more effect in some areas than others in terms of access to sexual and reproductive health programming. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well later on in this presentation. So thank you for that, Liz. In terms of protective factors, In general, we don't have a lot of information about protective factors, right? So most studies that we have focus on risk factors, but here is the little that we know. Higher educational attainment is linked to delaying parenthood, right? For moms especially, but also for dads a little bit. So again, as I've mentioned before, youth who are able to access higher education, for example, are more likely to delay parenthood to later years, and that might be because they are able to really feel like they could advance in their careers and their education, and would want to do that and not necessarily become parents early, which could jeopardize that. So that's really, in terms of individual protective factors, that has been the most consistent one that has emerged from the literature that we have reviewed. In terms of foster care experiences, a very consistent protective factor that has emerged from numerous well-conducted studies here in the US is that staying in extended foster care after age 18 has a protective effect on the likelihood of early childbirth. So those youth who stay in care until age 21 are less likely to become parents early, right? And that is a really significant thing, because that has some tangible policy implications. In general, remaining in extended care is related to various positive outcomes. Youth are more likely to enroll in school. They're more likely to have stable housing and less likely to be homeless. They're less likely to be involved with the criminal justice system, right? So there is all sorts of protective effects for staying in care after age 18. And we're going to touch a little bit on that later, but sometimes for young parents especially, it is harder to stay in care after age 18 because there's some barriers that they experience in terms of placements and in terms of their ability to live with the child's dad and other things. So I just want to put it out there, staying in extended care has a protective effect not only on lower rates of birth, but also on other outcomes, and we want to be mindful of that. We don't know a lot about protective factors, as I've said before, and we certainly don't know about gender-specific effects, right? Which factors are more important for dads as opposed to moms. So we really need more research in this area. We also looked at socioeconomic outcomes for young parents, and we really wanted to understand, and some of us here have studied this issue as well. We wanted to understand, well, if youth do become parents early, what does that do in terms of their outcomes, right? Are they more likely to have detrimental outcomes as they transition to adulthood? And if they are, what kind of outcomes are more at risk, right? So we looked at research on young moms and young dads, not a lot on young dads, but we tried to summarize what we know. And for moms, young mothers are more likely, young mothers have been in care, right? Even though it parallels general population as well. But young moms who have been in care are more likely to have lower educational attainment. So they're sort of less likely to graduate from high school and to enroll in higher education. They're less likely to be employed, and they have higher risk of homelessness and receipt of public assistance, or to have financial concerns more general. For young dads, there is the risk of lower educational attainment as well. Higher risk of homelessness for dads as well, even though we don't have a lot of research on dads in that regard. And then also higher risk of incarceration, according to some studies, or justice involvement, but no effects on employment. So a couple of studies actually have shown that while young moms are less likely to work, young dads are not less likely to work as compared to youth with foster care backgrounds who are not fathers, right? So some differential effects there. And again, we need more research, especially on the outcomes of young dads. We don't have a lot of that, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end of this presentation as to why that might be the case. And I just saw Liz mentioned in the chat that my typo, I apologize, Justin. This is me misspelling your name. So I apologize for that. All right. In terms of just one of the things that I wanted to mention in terms of effects. So the effects of early parenthood on outcomes might be temporary or might not be causal, right? So as we say, okay, young moms and young dads are at higher risk for detrimental outcomes, I want to note that this might not really mean that they are at risk for long, or that this risk doesn't represent pre-existing differences between the two groups, right? Between those youth who are likely to become young parents and those who are not. So essentially, we have a couple of studies that looked at this. I'll bring you two examples. In one study, young moms who gave birth by age 17, right, had similar socioeconomic outcomes to those girls who were not mothers at age 21. So if you account for subsequent births, these young moms who had a birth by age 17 didn't have an additional birth later on, right? They were quite similar in their outcomes to those youth who didn't have any birth at all, right? Whereas those youth who did give birth later, right, they were more disadvantaged, particularly in terms of educational and vocational attainment. So what does that mean? It could mean that when the kids are really young, obviously there is a burden on young moms, right? And because of that, the burden of childcare and caring for a young infant, they might be less likely to go to school, to be employed, might be more likely to receive public assistance through those early years. However, over time, they might catch up, right? When their children grow, they might re-enroll in school, they might pursue employment, so their outcomes at the long run might not be all that different. So this is something we need additional research on, right? Are the outcomes going to stay disparate, right? Are there going to be disparities in the long run? Or is there going to be a catch-up effect? There is at least one study that suggests there could be a catch-up effect later on. There is also another study that talks about the link between fatherhood and incarceration. And again, if you look sort of in a dichotomous kind of way, right, in a bivariate analysis, young dads have higher risk of incarceration at age 21. But if you account for their prior incarceration histories, then that link disappears, right? So it could be that it's not that young dads are more likely to be incarcerated, but actually youth who have been involved with the criminal justice system before are more likely to become fathers, right? So we have at least some studies that suggest that this effect is not positive, or there could be reverse causality there. Any questions about outcomes at this point before we move to perceptions? Well, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat there, and we'll be happy to reference this at the end. I want to mention, before we go to services, a little bit about just qualitative research primarily that looked at perceptions of parenthood. And the first thing that I want to note is a lot of the times we professionals consider that early parenthood is always unplanned. But for youth in care, that's not necessarily the case. And we have at least qualitative research suggests that some young people who have been in care plan to become parents. They want to become moms, they want to become dads, and they want to do that early. And the motivations for that, as I've said before, could be desire to have a family, to have unconditional love, to have respect in their communities. In some communities, early parenthood sort of comes with status and respect sometimes. So some youth, I think the bottom line is some youth want to be parents, right? So it's more complicated than let's provide effective pregnancy prevention programs. I think it's some of it, but it's not necessarily the whole story. And then in terms of perceptions, youth in care do consider parenthood to be challenging, but they are also consider it to be motivating. So they are often saying, at least in qualitative research, becoming a parent is a source of strength, right? I don't want to be involved in risky behaviors because I'm a parent and I think about my child. I want to create a better life for my child. I am going to go back to school. I'm going to work because I am motivated to create a better life for my children. So again, we just wanted to put out there that there is a complexity in the young parenthood phenomena, and we don't want to reduce it to just prevention, right? For some, yes, young parents need support. We're going to talk about services in a second. But they are also looking at parenthood as something positive, not always as something negative. Or even despite the challenges, they see positive sides in becoming parents. So it was important for us to reflect on that, because talking with a lot of young parents and being in this field for a while, we really see that complexity of kind of what early parenthood means for this youth. And then before I turn this over to Liz, I just want to say again, we really don't have a lot of information about the ways in which young fathers perceive their fatherhood. So those of you who are looking to do research in this area, I think this is a really good area to really enhance our evidence. We don't know what challenges are specifically experienced by dads. We don't know how they reflect and consider their challenges. So it would be really good to have additional research on this topic in particular. And Liz, it's all yours, and tell me when to scroll.
Wonderful, thank you. So just taking that thread along, when I first started working with young folks in foster care, I was working in a teen mother baby program. It was my first job out of graduate school. I was not yet a parent myself. I was like 23 years old and really didn't have any idea about parenting. And I was in this position of being a social worker working with young parents and trying to help them with their parenting. And what I realized was that there was so much to learn from just coming alongside and being with people as they were in that journey of parenting and helping them to figure out how to capitalize on all those things that they wished to do, which was to change the trajectory of their families, to really be able to stop this, what had often been intergenerational cycles of violence in their families, how to really make this next chapter in their life something that would be very positive for them and for their child. And of course, we see a range of outcomes among my clients alone. Some of them I would run into later in the community and they'd be like, "Hey, Miss Liz, so good to see you." And I'd be like, "Wow," in my mind, "last time I saw you, you were throwing a chair at me, but I'm so glad that you're now like working, have an apartment and are so stable." And others, ended unfortunately in tragedy, and it was a really very difficult outcome. So there's a whole range of outcomes. And a lot of the reasons for why the outcomes are so different among young parents is because of the services that are provided and whether or not we as a system and we as a society are able to really come alongside and come around families at the time at which they decide to have a child and support them. So just want to firmly state that we're from a group called Reshaping. And so I think we had that logo on there before. And we're a group of folks across the United States and Canada that do research on this population. And we do take a reproductive justice approach, meaning that we support people's inherent right to have children or not have children, to expand their families or not to do so at the time at which they decide to do that or not to do that. That is people's inherent right. And so really a lot of our work is around how do we help people to make the choices that work best for them, and how do we support them fully in ensuring that families can thrive in whatever way that they're formed at whatever timing that they're formed. So just shifting now to talking about some services. So in the United States, there are a few services that are available that are designed specifically from the ground up for this population, first of all. But there are several, kind of three main varieties of services out there that become more and more specialized for this population. The first is home visiting services. The second is independent living services. And then the third is programs specifically for young parents in foster care. And I'm going to specifically talk about young mothers because that's how the services are typically designed. And we'll talk about dads as well in a little bit. So you can go on to the next slide, Svetlana. Thank you. Okay, so home visiting programs. You all may have home visiting programs where you live. These are home visiting programs that are available to the general population, typically based on income or potential risk. So one of the, as we've been talking about, one of the potential risks is young parenthood, and not necessarily because that is an in and of itself inherently risky thing, but because our systems are not necessarily set up to support young families to be able to continue and finish school, to have free childcare, to have time with their child, those kinds of issues. Home visiting involves, just as it sounds, a home visitor coming to someone's home and providing services in the home. There's a wide variability in the United States of home visitors training. Some of them have a high school diploma or GED. Others of them have graduate training. So there's a wide variability in that. There's also wide variability in the frequency of visits. Sometimes people are coming multiple times a week, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, sometimes not even monthly. There's also variability in terms of the focus of visits. But in general, it is intended to be a focused time where the home visitor can come and sort of assess the needs of the family and say, what is it that this specific family needs to support the child's development and to support the family's needs, and that ideally also that parent-child relationship as well. We do have a fairly strong evidence base in the United States for effectiveness of home visiting programs. Even with this wide variability, they tend to be really well received and often well done. There's variability in that. We definitely need more research though for young parents who've specifically been in care. I'm going to talk in a minute about a study that was done, a pilot study about that. There's also a significant amount of variability in how available home visiting services are and how accessible those programs are, both between states in the U.S. and within states. So, for example, if there's a rural area where a home visitor is having a large coverage area and has to drive really far to get out to people's homes, or if there's a densely populated area like an urban center where there's just a concentration of families and a concentration of needs, both of those situations can contribute to decreases in folks who are perhaps eligible for the service actually receiving those home visiting services. And some of the outcomes that we do see of home visiting, just to say, why do we do this? Why do we support this? Are everything from improving children being able to get to doctor's visits to improve contraception care for young parents. Okay, we're going to move on then.
Oh, wow.
Lots of different great outcomes. Okay, so for example, we have one set of home visiting services that are being offered in Illinois for pregnant and parenting youth, and this is our colleague Amy Dworsky's work. So they found in their pilot study that home visiting services can be just as successfully delivered to pregnant and parenting youth in care as people who are in the general population, and that there are benefits that range from increases in child development and knowledge of child development, enhanced parenting skills, and improved co-parenting relationships. This is also a really, really important thing for pregnant and parenting youth in care. Next slide. Some things for us to consider are, as we would expect, it often took more time than usual for home visitors to build rapport and trust with participants, which is understandable given the child abuse and neglect that pregnant and parenting youth have experienced, and often how that then disrupts their formation of relationships with adults and others in their lives. There was also significant unstable living arrangements and mental health crises, which contributed to challenges in home visiting services delivery. Go to the next slide. Another bucket of services that are offered to young folks who are preparing to age out of the foster care system are independent living services. So these are often delivered in a group setting and are intended to be able to prepare young folks in foster care generally for being able to leave the foster care system. So these are some topics that are often covered: communication, personal development, daily living skills, and so on. So for example, these are often experiential group lessons that are offered. So they might go out and help the group of young folks set up a bank account and show them how to manage their money. They might show them how to like do their laundry, that sort of thing. Evidence for effectiveness is limited, even though I think this is probably something that is the most widely offered to young folks. Additional research is definitely needed here. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of services is treatment foster care mother-baby programs. And so these are specialized foster homes, group homes, and apartment placements or other individual placements that are offered specifically to young parents. And one example is from my wonderful community partner, Hearts and Homes for Youth. They have a program called the DeMomly program. It's a step-up program that's specifically for pregnant and parenting youth in care and mothers in care specifically. Step one is they're placed in a treatment foster home with a family that is specifically trained and wants to work with young parents. Once they're stabilized there and so have sort of been able to get what they can and being with that family, they move into a group home, which is a shared space with other mothers and babies. Some youth do really well in that kind of setting. They have more autonomy. It's sort of a roommate situation, great, opportunity to learn from that. Others really struggle with that, kind of situation. But if they get through step two, they can go to step three, which is where they get their own apartment. It's fully furnished. It's just them and their child or children. They don't have anybody else living there. So they have to be able to set those boundaries and not have their partner with them or their friends with them or anything like that. But they get that experience of living on their own before they then would prepare to move out. And some of my group's research has worked with people who are at that independent living apartment stage and beyond. And what we actually see happening is that young moms will meet other young moms, like either through these groups or through a group home situation, and they will form relationships and then actually move out with those women that they get along with later in their lives and live together.
And Liz, was this program evaluated in any way? I just am curious in terms of outcomes.
Not formally, but it's on my list of things that I'd like to do. I think that it's really promising as an approach.
I look forward to reading that. I think that would be amazing to see sort of the outcomes of folks that went through this program. Just one sec. My slides got stuck again. I apologize. Tayla, I know we're out of time. If there are questions, we are really happy to take them. I could also go through a little bit of these last couple slides to see if we could sort of use those for questions as well, because these are some of the challenges that we experience in service delivery here in the United States. So I don't know if you want us to go through those or just wait for a little bit of questions to come in. I haven't seen anything as of yet.
Yeah. So we got one now from Louise Robert, and she said, what is the time scale for the different stages of treatment foster care for mothers and children? I guess she referred to the programs that you mentioned.
Yeah, so in the DeMomly program, it's based on the mother's progress and how well they're doing. So like, let's say they're in the treatment foster care home and they're, they're stable there. They've learned what they can. And they may move on in as short as something like 6 months. They may need a little bit longer. It just really depends if they're ready to move up into that level of additional independence. So it's dependent on each individual person.
Thank you. I'm just see that there are no other questions right now, so you can go forward and then maybe we will leave like 2-3 minutes at the end and for question again.
Please feel free, everybody, to put questions as I speak about these. I see maybe something came in. Oh, okay, that's you, Liz. All right, so Liz, just alert me if you see a question in the chat, okay? And then I'll be happy we'll reference it. So one of the things we wanted to just sort of finish this presentation with is to talk about some challenges that we are now experiencing in service delivery with this population, and also some next steps that I think are important, we think are important. So one of the challenges that we've seen is the child welfare systems here in the United States, which are very different by state, right? So it's a little bit of a different setup than some of the other countries of origin for you all. But some systems have a system for tracking who are the youth in care who are parenting, and others do not, right? So there is a lot of unknown about who is a parent. And that, of course, limits what we can know about the outcomes and the challenges and the services that these young people get. This is especially true for dads, right? We're not good about tracking dads and who is a father. So that is certainly a challenge that we experience. As Liz has mentioned, services vary widely across jurisdictions and are quite limited outside of major urban areas. The funding streams for the services differ, which also affects variability. Some are funded through federal dollars, others through state dollars, and obviously this makes a difference. The other thing that we see is we don't necessarily have a lot of foster parents, caseworkers, and staff who are trained to work with teens and with young parents in particular. So that's an area for improvement. And then many of the programs, most, only serve females, and even the programs that serve females and males, their clients are mostly moms. So we don't necessarily have a lot of services for dads, and that is a big limitation. There are a lot of perceptions around, dads are not involved anyway, they don't live with their children, so they don't need to be served, and that is really just not necessarily true. So we really do need to expand services for dads. And I see a question here. I'm just going to read it. It seems that most programs for young moms focus on being a good mom and meeting their children's needs. Are there any programs focused more on the needs of mothers themselves, for example, their mental health? And also kind of the intersection of their roles as a mom. So this is a really good question. Liz, do you want to talk a little bit about your program and whether or not it has that?
Yes, so that is such a great question and so important, because we really do want for, women to understand and moms to understand that they are a mother, that's a very important role, but they are their own person as well, right? And we want for them to be fully celebrated and supported as their own person. So yes, the Damamli program does include, so in addition to the independent living type groups, they do have in-home therapy that's offered for the moms. They have educational supports and connections. So like GED. So like if people haven't finished high school, they can help them with getting credit towards what's called a GED, which is a substitute for a high school diploma in the United States. So there are absolutely other, there is a strong focus on the young woman herself, in addition to her role as a mother.
And also the independent living programs are supposedly providing skills broadly. The trouble is, again, based on some of the emerging research, some of the programs are not particularly effective for the youth who are getting them. And then we have a question from Louise. Has there been any focus on parental advocacy to support care experienced parents? So when you say advocacy, Louise, do you mean sort of programs kind of like peer mentorship, or did you mean something different there?
So she wrote peer or professionals.
Okay. So I am not familiar with peer kind of programs. I think it's a really good question. Liz, are you familiar with peer mentorship for moms who mentor other moms?
I mean, there's some of that, and I think that it's not formal, the way that it happens, but I'll say that in my research, the moms definitely are asking for that. They say that they would like to hear from other parents who've been through something similar. They'd like to be able to support other parents in sort of a peer advocacy kind of role and peer mentoring kind of role. But I think, in kind of taking this question another way on parental advocacy, how to advocate for yourself as a parent, I think that there isn't, I don't know if there's so much formal training and support that's done, but I would say informally, sure. Social workers will do that with their clients and help them to, figure out how do you make an appointment? How do you kind of speak up about the needs of your child and the needs of yourself. But it's tough, it's definitely tough. And we're talking about adolescence. Just generally, it's hard to advocate for yourself. It's hard to advocate for your child, and how to navigate doing that in a way that's effective to get what you want. That's tough. I don't think that that's something that is an explicit focus, but I think it happens a little more informally.
And Justin made a really good point about services, some of the focus being punitive. And this is something that is certainly we've seen both with respect to moms, but certainly with respect to dads. So we do need strengths-based services. And as we talk about sort of the recommendations, really a non-judgmental approach to young parents, right? Because once they sense that there is judgment involved, they're more likely to disengage. So that is something that is absolutely a focus that needs to be expanded. The other thing that we also wanted to mention before we go is that there's some limited housing options here in the United States for parents. So for example, those that want to live with their children on campus in college, there's not a lot for them in that respect, right? There's not a lot of family housing for undergraduate students. So then obviously these young women, for example, and also young men, are not able to pursue four-year degree if they can't afford housing that is close to campus, and they cannot access campus housing. And also, as I've said before, sometimes youth want to live with their father, with the father of the baby, or a young father wants to live with the mom. And that could be difficult if they stay in care as well. So that can motivate young parents to just leave foster care at age 18 when they're able to, which is actually not great for them, right, for their outcomes. So they're a disadvantage in terms of being able to take advantage of extended foster care. And then young moms and young dads worry about surveillance. Young moms worry about young dads about report to Child Protective Services, right? They worry about child support and things like that. So there are all these structural barriers that affect their likelihood to access services, and these need to be acknowledged. So what are some of the future directions? We need more intervention research, because most of the studies we have are focused on risk factors and prevalence rates. So we know that already. We know the prevalence is higher. We know the risk factors. We need to know what works for these young parents, right? So what are the effective components of sexual reproductive health programming, independent living services that could actually improve outcomes, peer mentorship, as somebody mentioned, programs to prevent child welfare involvement of kids, of youth in care, and then programs that help moms and dads to achieve good outcomes. All of this is really not well developed here in the United States. And then we also need, in general, more research on dads, in general, more research on protective factors and outcomes as well. And then in terms of policy and practice, we want to establish a consistent procedures for tracking young moms and young dads, right? So if we don't know who these young parents are, we're not able to serve them. So how do we do that? Acknowledging their concerns about surveillance, but also being able to serve them. And we have a toolkit that was developed that we included a link for. And then also just training caseworkers, parents, and everybody else how to talk about sex with kids, right? With teens, and how to work effectively with young parents from a non-stigmatizing perspective and non-judgmental approach. And then there is a slide here that really emphasizes the needs of young parents and how services must be multidimensional. So take a look at that. We don't have time to really go over that, but this is really just important in terms of making sure that multiple domains are considered when we serve them. Yeah, I think that's it. Leslie, do you have anything to add?
So thank you very much, Svetlana and Liz, for very inspiring presentation, and you took us to a long thoughts around this issue. And I have to say that you mentioned a lot the issue of fathers. So Justin is here, and I want to mention his articles that refer to the fathers and do analysis of what we know about fathers who are in care, and care leader Justin Harty. And I want to mention that this meeting is part of our effort as a group of that called Care Leavers as Parents, part of INTRAC. INTRAC is a national, international group that focused on living care. So if you are interested in joining us and joining our activity, feel free to look for us. Just look for INTRAC Care Leavers as Parents, and you can join us. I will also put the link in the chat. And thank you again, and I hope to see you in the next events.
Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Taylor.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
And you have a very short survey if you are happy to respond to.